Thank you all for joining us for the first semester, clearly not the first semester, the first seminar of the second term. We're really excited to have two international speakers with us today. So I'm very delighted to introduce you to Emma L Baysal, who is an Associate Professor at Bilkent University. She specialises in the prehistory of personal ornamentation, particularly the question of identity and self-expression at the Neolithic transition in Southwest Asia. She is the PI of the National Geographic Society funded project Small Things, Big Stories. I didn't plan ahead for turning this notepad over. And we also have Sera Yelozer, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Koç University Research Centre for Anatolian Civilizations in Turkey. She specialises in prehistoric personal ornaments with a focus on memory, social relations, and identities. She's also interested in feminist perspectives in archaeology and advanced gender studies within Turkish archaeology. And I am going to let you get straight on with it because that sounds really exciting to hear.
Thank you. So is this supposed to work now?
Yes. Yeah. So you won't hear it. Online people will hear it.
Perfect. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the presentation and the team for organizing this and inviting us. So today I'll do the first bit of talking and then Emma will take over. My part would be a bit more on the complaint side, and she will give us a bit more hope with what we've been trying to do in Turkey in the recent years. So we will try to look into the relationship between the question of identity and archaeology in Turkey, and we will try to do this through a decolonial and feminist perspective, which is kind of a difficult also for Turkey, a new attempt. We will try to cover many aspects that we will try to track together to give a comprehensive picture of how we approach identity in prehistoric Turkey and the sociopolitics that lie in the background. And then we will finish with an alternative reframing. So for starters, can start. Okay, so for starters, I want to give some numbers first. So the sociopolitics of archaeology today in Turkey, as seen through the gender dynamics and professional inequalities across departments, don't really paint a very hopeful picture, which is not a surprising thing. So in archaeology departments across Turkey today, the gender gap shows a 60 to 40 male-female split. It may seem a bit narrow, but when we look at how women and men progress within the field, we can begin addressing some problems, I think. So this graph shows gender gap across academic positions. What we see is that at the entry level, there's a 62 to 38 male-female split. This gap is true also for lecturer roles. It appears to be narrowing down in assistant professorship position, but then widens as people progress in their careers. So what we think is that it looks like the first barrier that can be termed like as a glass ceiling women face when progressing in their careers is at the entry level to academic archaeology. So let's look a bit more into this. Who graduates from archaeology departments, who progresses into grad school and then to entry-level positions. So the picture is a bit patchy, but the 2018-19 stats, for example, of archaeology BA graduates shows that more women than men graduate from archaeology departments. And then the stats from 2014 to 2020 shows that with a narrow gap, more male students than female students pursue master's and PhD degrees. But this gap seems to have narrowed down a bit in the more recent years. But what we see is fewer women than men end up in entry-level academic positions. So in summary, what we see is that more women than men graduate from archaeology, but fewer women than men secure entry-level jobs into the profession. And the second barrier to women progressing within the field is in the professorship and leadership positions. So the seemingly more equal picture we had seen in assistant professorship positions seems to change as people progress in their careers. More men than women become professors and more men than women become department chairs. Also, what's interesting is that even when there are women occupying equal or higher positions in the same department, there seems to be a higher tendency to choose men over women for administrative roles, which we see in like 16 cases. Uh, Another facet of this inequality illustrates itself in discrimination and misconduct. Also for this, we also have like very patchy evidence right now. So I wanted to give an example from a recent survey conducted among 436 archaeologists and students. The survey reports that 36% of the participants have faced discrimination based on their gender, sexual identity, or orientation, especially during archaeological fieldwork. And they have also reported discrimination based on their age, socioeconomic class, political views, ethnicity, or disabilities. So we can talk about this. Like, I don't think 36% is like representative at all. But we have to think about how many people report these cases as well. So against this kind of unsettling background of archaeological practice in Turkey, now I want to look at how its practitioners have framed and talked about identity as a question in their research. To do this, I wanted to exemplify from some publication stats. So what you see here is a graph showing the ratio of papers focusing on identity, with the orange ones, versus the total number of papers presented in theoretical archaeology conferences in Turkey. What we see is that throughout the last 2 decades or so, very few researchers have dealt with the question of identity. There seems to be a slight increase through time, but there hasn't been a substantial effort and interest in the archaeology of identities as a broad subject until 2021, which was when we organized the third meeting of the theoretical archaeology group in Turkey with the theme of identities. But since then, there hasn't been any new TAG meetings at all. So then what have we been up to? I mean, how does, and to a great extent still, do archaeologists in Turkey shape the discourse on identity? So especially for Neolithic research, the book series Neolithic in Turkey is a good barometer to look into this. What we see is that there is almost no mention at all of identities, but also what's more striking is the absence of people and the passive voice of writing. So we have information on, for example, burial skeletons, but they remain anonymous, contextless. We have lists of them, but no interpretation, also no contextual information, as I mentioned. So what we see is for Neolithic research, for example, the abstract concept of the hunter-gatherer or the early farmer. We have information on their architecture, but never the experience of inhabiting a place, for example. Also, the identification of human imagery, like the statues, figurines, etc. They're like directly related to cultic practices, shamanism, those kind of themes. But what this does is removing their immediately human representative quality. So we can blame the neutral language of reporting and the traditional conventional use of passive voice in archaeology in Turkey. But essentially what we are left with as readers is to roam in a very largely uninhabited Neolithic world. So this situation, all of these examples and patchy evidence may have given the impression that there has been an utter lack of interest in the question of identity, as I said. But when we flip the coin, I think what we're actually dealing with is that it's not a disinterest in how past communities express themselves per se, but the theoretical and the political approaches we align ourselves with. And the recent research in Neolithic Anatolia, especially southeastern parts, gives some examples on how Neolithic identities are being framed, especially with a male gaze built upon themes of monumentality and male power. And as an example, I want to talk about a Neolithic statue found in 2023 in southeastern Turkey at a site called Karahantepe. And I had so much fun preparing this slide, as you can see, because there has been a big press debate about this. So the statue was found in fragmented state in 3 pieces, discarded in the field of a building. Its face was a bit demolished, the phallus was broken, And then the archaeologists brought the upper and lower body back together and pasted back the phallus. And this act, we think, in a sense, decontextualized the whole story of why and how the statue was made, used, fragmented, and then deposited by the Neolithic people. And that it hasn't been properly published yet, but there has been a big sensation in the press about it. So in the first images released to the press, the phallus wasn't pasted back. But the marks of the old breakage, the Neolithic breakage, were visible. And then the media and the public first accused archaeologists to have broken it, like as censorship. And then the archaeologists had to make a press release stating that they had found the statue in fragmented state, and then they brought it back together for display and restoration purposes. So what's disturbing here is that it was indeed broken and fragmented, but it was part of the statue's life course during the Neolithic. So what we're more interested in is displaying such monumental statues when we share without contextual information might be interpreted as signaling male power and monumentality, etc. And like more broadly, this extends beyond individual statues to a fetishization of perceived human achievement in Neolithic Anatolia. The monumentality of the early Neolithic sites in especially southeastern Anatolia, particularly the sites of Taştepeler, which Göbekli Tepe is the most famous example of, and the most extensively excavated and publicized over the last few years, have become the focus of Neolithic achievement and have become the focus of how we understand and try to define what Neolithic is. I mean, all those sites and what happened there during the Neolithic, early stages of the Neolithic, is undoubtedly very important, but the monumental scale has eclipsed most other details of Neolithic society. But this is actually, it might seem like a new trend going at the same time with the politics in Turkey, but it's actually the logical culmination of studies over the years, decades, that have emphasized human cultural evolution as the central import of the Neolithic period. So when we view Neolithic as part of the road to civilization, for example, the focus on monumentality makes sense, especially as we know relatively very little about the social structure of Neolithic people. And another aspect of this extensively state-sponsored new research in the region is that it represents a new turn for the relationship of our discipline with the politics and the state. So to give a very brief explanation of what I mean by this is that the new financial and strategic plan of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in Türkiye is aimed at increasing the speed of excavation at archaeological sites to boost tourism, and B, they have set new regulations to coordinate foreign excavations in Turkey by that are run by foreign archaeologists, where they appoint Turkish coordinators, and then they recompose research teams with the obligation of having more Turkish researchers within the same team than the foreign ones. So when we think of this recomposition with the efforts of high-speed excavations, boosting tourism, etc., we can see that the aim is to make quick financial return, which I think we may describe this as capitalism and nationalism in tandem, but disguised as decolonization. So it's actually the culmination of a very long tradition of archaeological research in Turkey, and so the position we have arrived at in interpretation makes a lot of sense. So the politics regulating our research has many implications for the way we produce knowledge. And on the opposite side of this big monumentality, the small objects like personal ornaments, what we see is that they're little published. When they're published, they are decontextualized. Little attention is given to their context, also deposition categories. Little information is shared about their quantity, making it hard to think about the frequency and their relevance. Also, even less attention is given to how they were made, used, how they might have been reused, curated with changing meanings. Also, how they might have circulated across regions, individuals contributing to shaping interactions, relationships, and identities. I think the quote here explains, and it's not a single example, it explains how they've been interpreted as items of elegance, status, social stratification without a critical examination of their distribution, context, and frequency. And like I said, like many times in this introduction, this has also its historical and political roots, this approach. So I'm going to go back to the politics of it. Archaeology in Turkey, since its early years, since its establishment with the republic itself, have been structured by efforts of nation building and westernization. What we see is that early excavations were initiated by French and German archaeologists, and in the meantime, first generations of Turkish archaeologists were sent to Europe for education. And when they returned to Turkey around 1930s, they imported a culture historical approach looking for roots of civilizations in Anatolia. And from here onwards, a colonialist mindset in tandem with nationalism kind of emerged. Archaeologists' relationship with nationalism in Turkey has been widely discussed and to a certain extent criticized both by Turkish archaeologists and foreign researchers working in Western Asia. But what has not been widely criticized is the influence of processualism and positivism in our analytical and theoretical tools, which so this influence has shaped research for a large time frame, starting in the 1960s. In 1968, with the dam constructions in southeast Turkey, large-scale excavations began as joint projects of Turkish and foreign archaeologists, where new methods of excavation and recovery were introduced. And the archaeologists of that period who were trained in these projects were immensely influenced by processualism, but colonial legacies were also embraced, so they never rejected those. And through time, this illustrated itself in a very kind of, in a sense, hybrid image of an archaeologist, aligning itself with a mixture of culture, historical, and processual approaches. And throughout the 1980s and 90s, going back and forth between culture, history, and processualism, archaeology became more and more apolitical, which is due to the two consecutive military coups during the 70s and then in 1980. Contributing to an increasingly wider gap between archaeology and political movements and also social theory, especially those that challenged its binary epistemologies such as feminism. So now back to the Neolithic. How do these political relations and epistemologies influence our interpretation? So for starters, the words we use are as a result of the well-developed environment of culture historical archaeology embraced by a very traditional conservative academy. So what we see is a shorthand that automatically blurs the detail of the past and pacifies the people who live there. So such as these terms, the hunter-gatherer, early farmer, sedentarization, specialization, they are useful for like as a theoretical abstraction, but they express no agency. So the words we use do not kind of dance like our painted person from Çatalhöyük here. We think of the hunter-gatherer, for example, as a type of person, but with no detail, defined only through the way they produced food, never by how they behaved, interacted, or felt. Likewise, the farmer is a different creature who does not commune with the hunter-gatherer, occupying both a different time and a different world, and they do not meet. So what this approach effectively results is the idea of a normative monolithic Neolithic identity involving the big change from mobile hunter-gatherer to settled villager, the former having, this was a quote, flexible, situative, individual and spontaneous social and ritual concepts, and the latter, the farmer, becoming orthodox. So conflating cultural, historical, and processual approaches to material culture in the characterization of the Neolithic has entailed the decontextualization of artifacts through primarily an art historical approach. And this, unfortunately, has increased more in the recent years rather than following the more promising international trends. So what is the antidote to this? And what are we trying to do here? What we want to achieve, which is a hard thing, of course, but at least start talking about is overturning this colonial narrative of increasing power and complexity and rethinking the simplistic passive terminology to really understand what happened to people during the very slow transition from Paleolithic to the Neolithic. So with a launched review, which involves stripping away from assumed timelines and narratives, not looking for linear complexity, not making statements about economic efficiency, least cost pathways, etc., but instead aiming for an intersectional understanding of who people were, how they perceived themselves, and how they related to each other. And now Emma is going to come to give some, hopefully some hope.
Yeah. It's good. Okay. So I'm actually just going to have a drink. Yeah, so in order to deal with this, I mean, I can't emphasize enough, putting what Sarah says into context. If you think about the world that you occupy over here, where people are researching lots and lots of diverse topics, we have a much narrower view of research in Turkey. So we have a lot of very traditionalized research fields. We have a lot of people who might work on pottery or chipstone. There is literally nobody who's working on these kind of materials. So I need to put that into that kind of context. It's not just that they're not thinking about it in new and interesting ways. There's literally nobody thinking about it at all. So, just to, be a bit dramatic about it. So we're not only kind of reframing a narrative, I think we're actually making a narrative in some senses, at least for the smaller objects that we have. Yeah, we've tried to think about, well, building this as a specialism in Turkey. So the idea of studying small objects as an actual area of specialism has been a project in itself. In a conservative environment, it's quite difficult to think about how things might be done differently. And actually we meet resistance in the form of, for example, people saying, well, no, because that isn't something that you can do. So that just isn't a thing. We don't accept that beads can be studied as a significant area of material culture. So that's the kind of background that we're starting from. We are lucky to be in a position to do some very different things. Obviously, we both have different ways of thinking about things and something of a theoretical background that drives us to want to do things differently. And obviously moving away from what might be a traditional approach of looking at typology and materials and the things that people have traditionally used to look at, for example, the kind of objects that you see here, like stone beads. What might people traditionally look at with stone, where the stone came from, how these objects were made, what shapes they are. This is really the kind of environment that we've stepped into. To give you a bit of geographic context, because we're sort of aware that you don't really all know particularly much about where we're actually working here. Obviously, you all know where modern Türkiye is. Geographically speaking, in terms of archaeology, we're looking at Western Asia. So we're talking about the region where the things we're dealing with are the beginnings of the Neolithic process itself. You've probably, everybody here, every student, I guess, has heard of Çatalhöyük as an example, and you all say, yeah, it's the standard thing. So the wider context of that and the earlier context of what happens before Çatalhöyük develops. So what gets us to the stage where we have a site like that, basically, is what we're looking at. And we're talking about a region that was obviously inhabited by hunter-gatherer groups. So hence this discussion of hunter-gatherers as a concept, this sort of slightly shapeless idea of the hunter-gatherer roaming around doing economic activities, whatever that means. And then the idea that those people settle down into settled communities, that there's some kind of, I mean, obviously we don't really talk about revolution anymore, but we can't get away from the shadow of the idea of the Neolithic revolution. It's fairly difficult to escape from that. But the idea that these people decide to settle down, there's a sort of wholesale change in everything that happens at some point. And this is an area where that begins to happen, essentially. So we're really looking at the roots of a lot of things within this geographical region, essentially. Yeah, so to summarize it, the idea of having architecture in a meaningful sense, the idea of having very different relationships with landscapes. So the idea that you no longer roam around a landscape, but actually live in one place and exploit that particular place. Obviously, the way we think about it now is in terms of actual continuation of hunter-gathering rather than this crazy revolution where everything suddenly changes. And in fact, these early communities are all continuing with a hunter-gatherer lifestyle rather than dramatically turning into herding farmers suddenly overnight. That just doesn't happen. And it's become increasingly evident that settlement happens first, and people gradually change their relationship with the landscape, probably as a result of a settled lifestyle. What drives them to do that, we do not know. Then we look at the idea of what changes with that and what really changes, and whether continuity is more of a thing than change, and how we might think about that more generally, but also within small bits of material culture. And then, yeah, this idea of changing relationships with the sources of food, which is a whole different subject and nothing to do with what we do, but it also changes the way that people relate to the world around them, which is relevant to what we're doing, I think. So we've tried to look at things in a sort of the most sort of broad sense that we possibly can, I think, rather than restricting ourselves to traditional material study. So what does this project do? What we've been working on for nearly 2 years now, but actually what we've been working on for many, many years before that in reality, is what's happening in central Turkey, so modern central Turkey, at a number of sites that have been particularly well excavated. So obviously, with small artifacts, contexts are important, the quality of the way that people dig is important, and to think about the data that we're getting, finding sites with usable data is not always the easiest thing in the world. We're quite limited in that sense. We're lucky to have a series of sites where we can do that. And that allows us to ask some more sort of serious questions of the material that we're dealing with. And we're looking at different scales. So the idea of what would a group identity look like as expressed through the human body in the early Neolithic? And is there such a thing even? We talk a lot about group identities, but if nobody's actually produced any evidence to say what that would be, I think. The idea of shared traditions and what that would mean, the idea of what time means within this framework to people. So do things carry on for long periods, or do things change rapidly? Even the concepts of gender, age, personhood. So things like, are babies regarded as being full members of a community, and at what stage? Because in many contexts, they're not necessarily, depending on survival rates, dangers, and all this kind of thing. So how, for example, does that actually work? What do relationships look like? Who relates to who and how? Not just genetically, because it goes far beyond the idea of genetic relationships. The idea of value, it's one of the most misused words in archaeology, of course. And what does that mean in this context? The idea of value is a very strange thing, and I'll show you some of these examples which show how differently we have to think about it, I think. The ideas of individual history is at a micro scale. So the fact that artifacts are incredibly dynamic things in themselves. And then the idea of combination and assemblage. So the fact that artifacts have really different experiences during their life history. So they go through lots of different permutations, and they relate with lots of different artifacts as well as people during their lifespans, which is something that hasn't really been considered for this. So the places we're talking about mostly, with a few additions, are these sites, that's Aşıklı and Balıklı. Boncuklu can also Pınarbaşı for a slightly longer perspective on the hunter-gatherers. They're all fairly close to each other, which helps a lot. And what it's also told us is that the idea that we can characterize regional trends is essentially absolute nonsense. We don't have such a thing as a coherent Neolithic of a region. That's one thing, you know, we can say right from now. It just doesn't actually exist at all. What we have, if we look at the materials, this is a fantastic montage that Sera made with all the different things, examples of all the different things that we might find. There's obviously massive diversity there rather than a lovely typology. I think that's the opposite of being a lovely typology. It's all kinds of things. There's animal teeth, bone, there's marine shells, there's freshwater shells. There are an enormous number of different types of stone and minerals in all kinds of different forms. And all of those things you will notice are exceptionally unstandardized. And it's fairly representative of what we find, except that there are a lot more little disc beads than we've shown in this picture to give you an idea. But the rest of it is quite representative. This is an enormously diverse selection of stuff that we have to deal with, all kinds of different materials. What we can look at through this, though, and what it gives us an amazing opportunity to do is to think about the different ways that materials were treated through time. So, you know, one of our big examples is shells are something that we all know, you know, starts in the Paleolithic. It's one of the earliest groups of things to be used. They show the most incredible continuity, and no matter what happens to human populations and how people's lifestyles change, they continue to go and get them somehow. We don't necessarily know how that would happen, but they continue to engage with them in some way, which is, you know, it shows an effort to continue with certain practices that, I mean, obviously we can't possibly know why. I think that's beyond anything we could ever do. We can also look at the effort that goes into making these things. So how people go about producing things, where they go about producing things, who knows how to produce things, because not everybody does. And it's very obvious that we have differentiation in how that happens. And then relationships between people and things that are based on where people are as well. So sort of relationships within particular areas and sites and that kind of thing. Some of the most interesting things about this, and what we didn't really expect, because, you know, nobody thinks that beads are particularly something that you might give a huge amount of value to. We noticed, and this seems to be a universal thing, that some ornaments associated with the human body were subject to unbelievably extreme use. Now, it's not particularly difficult to make these things. You could replace them. So this indicates that people were deliberately, for whatever reason, holding on to things. When they broke, they were curating them. So the examples that you can see here are very badly broken. The one in the middle obviously has no perforation left at all. You can't suspend it. It doesn't do anything anymore. But they've smoothed off the edges to make it into, it was broken quite, you know, obviously violently broken in half with quite rough edges. They've smoothed that all off. And this thing in its new format as a knot bead has carried on somehow its life in whatever it's doing, we don't know. And the other examples, they've still got a bit of perforation left, but they've had all their broken edges smoothed off. But not, I mean, not in a remotely what we would think of as an aesthetic way. They look awful by, obviously, the standards that we're judging them by. They've lost all their shape. They're completely wonky, but that doesn't seem to matter as part of this pattern of usage. This is associated, so these set of practices is associated with larger artifacts, and what we think are imported artifacts. So these, none of these come from the central Anatolian sites. They all seem to come from the southeast, which is, when we say the southeast, we're talking about the same area as Göbekli and the Taştepeler sites. And they are arriving in central Turkey and being used there and receiving exceptional treatment for whatever reason. So they're subject to prolonged use and recycling. These examples are from burial contexts, which are obviously particularly helpful in understanding who might have used these things. It's very difficult to pinpoint that. In this case, we have beads deposited with a baby, which has, again, if we think about the age of these beads, they're obviously massively used and broken before being deposited. So they've been either used by the baby when it was alive and then deposited like this, one at the front and one at the back, or been gifted as part of the burial process. Of course, we can't determine that, but these are old beads that have been reused in some way with a young individual, essentially. So it's an interesting thought that these are sort of heirloomed in some way. At least we can say that much. This is another detailed example. This is from Ashikla. Both these are from the sites in Cappadocia. In adult cases, we also see similar things. So it's not just with young children that this happens. In this case, there's a bead that's been reshaped. You can see on the right-hand side. So it started off as what we would think of as a button shape. I mean, it doesn't mean it was used as a button, but it's something we would think of as a button shape. It's been assembled within an ornament and then deposited with an adult male as part of an assembled ornament. With obviously great use before, and with other objects that are also reused as well. So they're interesting assemblages of objects that have lived different lives before being deposited and recombined with each other. Single green beads with babies seems to be a phenomenon. It might be related with breastfeeding practices. So if there's a category of people, whatever that is, that might be considered to be associated with these green beads, that seems to be associated with breastfeeding aged children, and then also with older women. So possibly post-childbearing aged women in the community might potentially be receiving similar treatment. Whether this is attributable to particular types of personhood or categorization, it's possible within society. It suggests that there are changes in the way that people are perceived during the course of their lives. It's also possible that these items have apotropaic qualities, so they might be used for protective purposes. So if you think of evil eye beads today, that we might, you use a blue bead to protect yourself, it's possible that we're seeing something similar with green beads in the Neolithic, which is an interesting, this is an interesting question about whether we can understand people's belief systems or not, and how that would work. So we can also identify, that's the kind of how we might look at individuals. We have very clear evidence that the quality of production, I mean, we often talk about production of artifacts. We have very clear evidence that the quality of production is related to different places. So in some places, they learn how to do some things, and in other places, they don't learn how to do those things. We can very clearly trace that at each of the sites that we're studying, actually. There's a definite distinction. In local production, we tend to have much more, this is in central Turkey, the local production, we tend to have much worse quality products because they basically don't have a great skill set, which is interesting in itself. They don't also have a great success rate with actually making these things. So they often start them, realize that they can't actually do the thing that they're trying to do, and then just give up halfway through. So it seems like an interesting question of, why they're not practicing, why they're never gaining the skills to do this, and why they would keep attempting to do these things when it seems they kind of know that they can't necessarily achieve it. They tend to use local materials for this. So there's a lot of, they'll just pick up pebbles, for example. We don't have a lot of stone sources in much of this. It's certainly in the south part of the area that we're studying. There are local stone sources. It's not easy to find raw materials to use, but they tend to pick up anything, bits of misshape and things and river pebbles. There's a really high abandonment rate for these, like I said. So the top one here, which is a horrible, weirdly shaped, lumpy thing, where they've tried to perforate it from both sides and utterly failed. So they've just abandoned it halfway through. It's unclear what they were trying to achieve and if they had a particular thing in mind or not. I'd say that's highly debatable. The non-local beads, in complete contrast to this, we say this with some certainty. There's absolutely no evidence at all for their local production. So there's no evidence that they know how to drill them. We don't have any drills that would be suitable for the production of these beads at all. And they fit, you know, the only comparable examples come from the southeast. So Mesopotamia, essentially, the Tigris and Euphrates region. And so we have to assume that that's likely where they're coming from. Raw material sourcing is not particularly possible for this because all of the materials tend to be things that are found randomly. So even in the southeast, they will use stones that are coming from the rivers, which means we don't know where they're coming from because they're just rolled stone pieces that have come from, you know, goodness knows where. It makes it very difficult to understand exactly where anything's coming from. What we can say is they're way, way better made. So they make much more beautiful things, much more carefully. There's much more investment in terms of time in trying to make stuff. And these are the ones that are subject to exaggerated reuse. There's a definite correlation. Sometimes they're deposited in burials, but actually not always. We have a lot of them that are not. At Boncuklu, for example, they're very much not deposited in burials. They continue in use, basically, I think, until somebody loses them. They just carry on. They never throw them away, so for whatever reason. What we're trying to do in the long term, I mean, I'm not saying we have any great results for this yet, but is to think about ongoing relationships between different regions, which is something that it's been done for materials like obsidian. You've probably all heard of obsidian as a great example of a material that moves around a lot in the Neolithic. What it hasn't been done for is things like this. So it's telling a new story to think about how small items were moving around, and they are massively mobile because they're small, because people can carry them around. It's extremely easy to carry these. You don't need a huge bag to carry lots of little beads around with you. They can be very much a byproduct of other interactions that are happening. So it's interesting to characterize, particularly at the transition to the Neolithic, how people are continuing to interact between different areas in ways that hunter-gatherers might have been interacting between different areas, and think about why they're continuing with those interactions and what that means. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, they're still getting the shells from the sea. They're making the effort in some way to procure things from the marine environment. We have no idea how that's happening, but what does that mean to them? And why would they continue to do that? And are there other activities attached to that? I mean, that's harder to identify, obviously, but they're definitely in some way communicating either with people who are at the sea, in whatever people perhaps living there, or they themselves are roaming around still, which again makes us rethink this idea of the hunter-gatherers and the sedentary communities and what people are doing and how people might be behaving. So, food for thought. And what we're trying to do through this project in its kind of results phase, which we're going to get to, hopefully shortly, we're going to get there. But what we've been trying to build up is an idea that typology just doesn't really work for materials like this. Us sitting down and trying to classify stuff is not an activity that we can really productively engage in. And actually, we need to look at these artifacts as dynamic objects that do not stay the same, that change radically through time, that interact possibly with lots and lots of different people in lots and lots of different contexts. The idea of an item of jewelry is deeply unhelpful because people change the things around and swap them and collect them and drop them and then remake them, and necklaces snap and then people pick up bits and pieces. People swap things between them. They might gift things, they might, you know, all kinds of interactions that might take place. And what you end up with is a palimpsest of all kinds of different objects put together in these amazing combinations. Which, I mean, it's incredibly difficult to interpret this. We can't really offer a solution to it, so that's very difficult. But we're trying to think differently about them and trying to record as much as we can of their life histories. We're looking at every aspect of surface wear, everything that's happened to them in the most micro scale that we possibly can, in order to try and work out the interactions that they might have had and how long their lives might have lasted. Seeing if this changes through time and what changes through time. I mean, these are all stone beads, but obviously we're looking at actually lots of different materials. So seeing how people's relationships with different materials changes through time. Thinking about what an assemblage looks like, where we find it, how we see things, what losing things looks like, what deliberately depositing things looks like. It's one of the questions that's also been tackled at Chattelhoek, of course. It's incredibly complicated to try and figure it out. And trying to figure out how we can talk about skill and technology and what that really means, and does it actually mean anything, and how do we talk about it in the case of things like this, where we have people who clearly don't have much idea or a huge amount of accumulated practice and skill, who are trying to do things. And then possibly a respect shown for people who do have the skills, and the fact that people appreciate objects that might come from quite different contexts and that might be made by really different people who they may never have had any contact with and never have met. So they've got these kind of distant relationships that might be based entirely around objects and not around their own actual contacts. So that's a bit of a summary of what we're trying to do. I'm not going to present any amazing results here because we don't have an amazing final result yet. We will, but this is a manifesto for how we're approaching stuff, at least. Yeah, so we hope after this that these kind of studies will be taken more seriously in Turkey and in other places as well, in surrounding regions maybe. And that these might be used better as a way to think about Neolithic people and the things that happened in the Neolithic and the interactions that might have taken place and the relationships, and how people thought about material culture in a slightly deeper way than the ways that Sera described earlier, with the kind of monumental architecture which has just taken over absolutely everything. So I'm hoping that we have a more positive future with the studies of the smaller things, at least. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, we're super happy to answer them.
Thanks, guys. That was great. I wondered, I see it between the lines, but I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about how you think about this material, not just as a really cool way to do archaeology, but as a feminist way to do archaeology.
You do it.
Oh, okay, so I think it helps us, especially those small things, but also like all types of evidence. They help us to look for the more close relationships between people, how they see themselves, how they differentiated themselves from other people. And we can through that think about like how diverse the past was, instead of everyone like looking the same, or like differentiation meaning something necessarily negative, for example. Yeah, this kind of answers, does it? Yes.
I'm not sure I was, but thank you anyway. That was a really great paper. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And I guess my question was about scale. You had a really nice slide of scale of like macro and micro and different things like that on it. And I was wondering about what are the possibilities for using the kind of detailed, really fabulously detailed research on these objects to kind of challenge some of the ways we divide micro and macro up from each other, and how in some ways each of your beads struck me as like massively macro in its own thing, like a single shell that both speaks back to the Paleolithic and tells you about a process that took a few seconds. And how is there something more about the way in which what seems so small, I mean, like in the kind of extensive sense that they're a couple of centimeters across or less or whatever, it's actually really massive at the same time. But then perhaps the reverse, what might seem really massive can also be really small. And therefore, if scale's working in ways that aren't quite so neatly linear, that are actually folded or compressed or scrumpled up like a handkerchief, we might end up with quite different kinds of narratives about both kind of material culture you're working with, but actually in archaeology more generally.
I kind of agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly an issue. I should also, I mean, there's this, hang on, where's this slide gone? We sort of deliberately, where is it? Oh, it's this one. Yeah, we deliberately have used this. Yeah, this isn't the only area of artifacts that have not actually been looked at very much. We've got a whole heap of things, including, and I find this incredibly surprising that people don't look at these. Well, the figurines are not properly studied. There are no detailed studies at all of the Neolithic figurines from a lot of places, as Christina knows as well. You know, it's extremely extraordinary to me that people don't. These are extremely direct sources of information, and yeah, all of these things need to be put together. It isn't, you know, we're just sort of picking away at a tiny little bit of an enormous problem, I think. And in terms of that, yeah, if you look at temporal scale, something that I think the shells are fascinating because they are genuinely massive. I mean, they're the most massive things that you can possibly imagine. And actually, we're trying to trace that further. I'm looking at things that go way on into the Bronze Age, for example. This is stuff that stays with people through all kinds of the things that we think of as the big processes of the past. It goes right through it. It's extraordinary. So yeah, we need to think about things at completely different scales. And the way that, I mean, what did people think about these objects and where they were coming from, and how did they understand things that came from elsewhere as well? I don't even know how we can think about that. It's extremely difficult. But yeah, the different scales in terms of like space and time and the objects themselves, it's yeah, there's an awful lot more work to do.
Visual gaze is seen as a significance, where other sorts of material culture inherently is seen as historical and worthy of study. A question I have as just an outsider to this discourse is, of course, you mentioned Chatal, that kind of loops in the background here. Because in the first part, you talked about how things like gender and identity and personhood hasn't really been studied. But of course, some of the studies coming out of Chatal, very much of it in that vein, also figurines, but Lynn Mescal's work.
Yeah.
And so I wondered whether And am I picking up an undercurrent that there's a difference, either a site-based difference or between what foreign researchers are doing versus what Turkish researchers are doing? So could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. So we're actually we've been debating doing some work on this for a long time. Çatal is essentially a bit of an island in research within Turkey. So we've had a massive disconnect. And this is not, this is not a criticism of anyone in particular. It's a very specific phenomenon related to the idea behind the Çatal excavation, behind Ian's Çatal excavation. That brought about a kind of isolation that has not actually been very helpful, I think. Like,
But also, not everyone wanted to engage with what he's been trying to do there. Like, at least from the point of Turkish archaeologists.
yeah,
they didn't want to engage with him much.
No, it's been, I think the theoretical theory has not been particularly well received in Turkey generally. It hasn't been, there have been these conferences and attempts to sort of popularize it, but it hasn't, it's been perceived in quite a hostile way by a lot of Turkish archaeologists who are quite comfortable with the way they approach things, which is essentially culture historical, and they don't necessarily want to engage with anything outside of that. But it's led to this kind of isolation of the site as a kind of, yes, there's all this fancy stuff happening, but that's not being related to anything else in Turkey. And we would like, I mean, it's one of the things we're going to think about doing, but it's quite a big thing to do, is, for example, relating all of the personal ornaments of Çatal to everything else, which hasn't happened yet at all. Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think the colonial problems are still massive. People don't read things in Turkish, but they also don't read English language publications by Turkish scholars. It's a sad truth. I mean, I don't like to say it like that, but it really doesn't happen still. And the referencing, it's perhaps another statistical study that we might look at doing. Referencing doesn't happen. It's great saying you're decolonizing and everything, but if you don't read anything that anybody's writing, and if nobody's communicating at all, nothing's actually happening really. So there's a kind of whole heap of problems on top of each other that, need thinking about. And half the projects we're talking about here are foreign projects as well. The foreign projects are not even necessarily talking to each other particularly well, actually. So there's also that. I don't know if you want to say anything else, but
layers of problems, some more urgent, some has been looming for decades. Yeah.
Takes a lot of time.
Anna chat specifically referenced one of your slides, Emma, with amber in some teeth.
Do you think?
Could be carnelian, I think.
I think it's carnelian, it's not amber.
We don't have amber.
That one, probably.
Yes, she's asked, is the lozenge-shaped bead in the image of all the different materials made of jadeite? If so, we have similar.
Oh, okay.
This might be
I don't know which. This one, probably, yeah.
It's green.
Maybe you should
the
use
left
this.
of the carnelian. Oh, so I think the two next to the carnelian.
These ones? That one?
The top ones, I think.
We don't have, I'll just be completely honest about this.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of material identifications. What we didn't speak about, because it's a whole other thing, is
The serpentinite or something. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure, yeah.
the rules that we have to work under mean that we can't necessarily, the analyses that we can do are somewhat limited to the things that we can do on site, basically. It's a problem we know in a lot of countries you can't always move materials around, so we don't, always get to do as much analysis as we might want to, which is another problem. It's the rules are put in place for very sensible reasons to do with, again, mostly the colonial past of people stealing stuff and then trying to make things not get stolen now. Is a kind of top priority, but it also means we can't do all the things we want to do. But yeah, we have a lot of different sort of medium hardness green stones, and they seem to be fascinated with the concept of green. It's a green thing. in the Neolithic as people who work on the Neolithic. No, they love green things a lot.
Give you the alternative Christmas option to that one. As Tanya has asked, do they have a source for the bright red stones? I work in Sorgun, in the Sorgun area of Turkey, and we have bright red stones at the excavation house that I was told originally were local, but I haven't really thought about them much since. So if the speakers have any extra
Red ones are your ones. I'm not saying.
I think, yeah. I mean, again, we haven't done any raw material sourcing on these, but they're obviously carnelian. We don't know the source, unfortunately, and they appear like literally the exact same technology, also morphology in the Upper Mesopotamia, also in Southern Levant. So yeah, someone's gotta do sourcing on this. Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's the question we've got to him. So I'm trying to think of a list of various things I could say. Thank you to everyone who's joined us here in person for the first seminar, and thank you to everyone online. I'd also like to formally welcome our new seminar team members, our fresh-faced first years, who kindly all sat together and there. So we've got Molly, Hannah, Jacob, Mike, and Naomi at the front, who kindly joined us. And next week we will be welcoming Dr. Nauman Rayat from the law school, who does the Global South Network. And if anyone has any further questions, we will go into the marquee on London Road, and please do join us. And I think all that's left to do is give you a final round of applause.